The first person to stop laughing was the county flood officer. Calvin Baird stood knee-deep in mud below Agnes Whitlow's field, staring at water that should have rushed straight into Ridgeford's Main Street. But it had not. The current had turned sideways, broken into narrow channels, and poured into an old spill basin no one had bothered to mark on the modern maps. Behind him, Quinn Harrow's survey flags floated across the brown water, like little white bones. Only 2 days earlier, that same developer had called Agnes's stone rows worthless. Her neighbors had nodded, as if the matter were settled. Even her own son had told her the farm was dying, and that one good offer should not be ruined by a few old rocks no machine could plow around. Then someone in the meeting room laughed and said Agnes cared more about stones than people. Agnes did not answer. She only looked toward the hillside, where her father, once a railroad laborer, had spent years setting every rock by hand. He had always told her those rows were meant to slow water, but he had never told her the whole reason. The flood revealed the first truth. The stones worked. The mud revealed the second. The lowest row had never been random. Each large stone carried initials, crew numbers, dates, and one symbol Agnes had seen all her life on her father's old railroad watch. What Ridgeford called a useless field boundary was really a map, and if Agnes followed it to the end, saving the town might not be enough. If stories about forgotten people, old promises, and things the world was too quick to throw away mean something to you, stay with this one. Because what happened in Ridgeford was not just about an old woman, a dying farm, or rows of stone. It was about the truth waiting beneath the mud. Ridgeford Grange Hall smelled of wet coats, burnt coffee, and old pine floors. Rain tapped the windows, making every farmer glance outside. Agnes Whitlow sat in the second row with her purse on her knees. She was 74, narrow through the shoulders, silver hair pinned tight, dry clay still caught in her boots. People knew her as Samuel Whitlow's daughter, Matt's mother, and the widow who kept a failing farm on the North Ridge beyond common sense. At the front, Quinn Harrow stood beside a projector screen showing her hillside's future. 12 rental cabins, a gravel access road, a scenic overlook, walking trails marked in clean green lines. Everything looked profitable. Everything except the crooked gray lines crossing Agnes's back field. Quinn tapped them with a laser pointer. And these, he said, are the stone rows Mrs. Whitlow insists cannot be disturbed. A few people chuckled. On the screen, the rows looked foolish. Not walls, not fences. Just low lines of fieldstone cutting across the slope, making mowing hard, plowing awkward, and any clean plan nearly impossible. Quinn turned toward Agnes. With respect, ma'am, they may mean something to your family, but they have no recorded agricultural value, no registered historical status, and according to county maps, no drainage purpose. Calvin Baird, the county flood officer, opened his folder. The current model shows runoff moving through the marked low channel west of Main Street, he said. There is no mapped spill basin on Mrs. Whitlow's property, no documented diversion system. Quinn nodded, as if the county had buried her father beneath paperwork. There you have it. Behind Agnes, someone whispered, "All that fuss over rocks." Another voice said, "My mower hit one of those things 20 years ago." The room warmed with laughter. Matt sat beside his mother, but he did not laugh. Because Quinn's offer could pay the back taxes, patch the barn roof, and let Agnes stop heating only 2 rooms when winter came hard. This project brings jobs, tourism, and revenue into Ridgeford, Quinn said. And Mrs. Whitlow has been offered more than fair market value. The words sounded polite. The room heard what they meant. An old woman was standing in the way. Agnes looked at the map. Her field had been flattened into color blocks. The slope was gone. The wet hollow was gone. Her father's work had become gray marks under a developer's pointer. Calvin cleared his throat. There is also the matter of safety. If the rows are loose, the county may require removal or stabilization. Agnes turned her head. "Removal," she said softly. "From land I haven't sold." For half a second, the room went still. Then Quinn smiled. "Not yet." Matt closed his eyes. Agnes stood slowly. The scrape of her chair carried through the room. "My father put those stones there," she said. Quinn lowered the pointer. "And I respect that." "No," Agnes said. "You don't." A few people shifted. She looked at Calvin, then toward the rain-dark windows. "My father worked the Ridgeford Spur before most of these roads had names. He told me one thing, and he made me promise I would not forget it." Matt whispered, "Mom, please." Agnes kept her eyes forward. He said, "Never let the water run straight down into town." Silence held for one breath. Then a man in the back laughed. Someone else followed. Soon the sound moved through the room, not loud enough to be called cruel, but loud enough to make Agnes's face go pale. Quinn did not laugh. He did something worse. He reached into his folder and removed a final page. "Mrs. Whitlow, the offer remains open for 48 hours. After that, we proceed with county review. If the rows are deemed unsafe, removal can be ordered whether or not a sale is complete." Agnes took the paper. The amount printed near the bottom was more money than her farm had seen in 30 years. "Mom," Matt said, his voice breaking, "that's the house, that's the taxes, that's everything." Agnes folded the paper once. Then again, she placed it inside her purse beside her father's old brass railroad watch. It no longer kept time, but she still carried it on storm days. On the back was a scratched symbol she had never understood, a triangle crossed by 3 thin lines. Outside, the rain strengthened. They watched an old woman walk out with 48 hours to choose between saving her farm and keeping a promise nobody in Ridgeford believed. By the time Agnes reached her truck, water was already gathering along the roadside ditch. Not rushing, not yet. She looked north toward the dark ridge, where the stone rows waited under the grass. Then she whispered the words her father had whispered before every storm. Not straight down. Agnes Whitlow learned the weight of stone before she learned the weight of silence. She was 9 the first time her father took her up the north ridge after a hard rain. The morning was cold enough to turn her fingers red, and the field smelled of wet clay, crushed grass, and iron from the railroad tracks below town. Samuel Whitlow walked ahead with a burlap sack over one shoulder and a limp he tried to hide. He had one knee that never bent right after a coupling accident on the Ridgeford spur. His left hand had a crushed middle finger that curled inward, as if still holding a tool. He never explained it. He never explained much unless water was involved. That morning, he pointed to a stone the rain had shifted out of place. "Put it back where it was," he said. Agnes looked at the crooked line of rocks crossing the hillside. "How do I know where it was?" Samuel crouched beside her. He did not look toward the farmhouse or the road. He looked at the mud, see where the water cut. She saw nothing at first. Only brown streaks, bent grass, and small pools shining between weeds. Then he touched one mark with his bad finger. A thin channel had curved around the missing stone, then rushed downward in a narrow groove. "Water remembers," he said. "It may look confused, but it remembers every path you give it." Agnes picked up the stone with both hands. It was heavier than she expected. She set it where he pointed. Samuel nudged it with his boot, turning the flat side uphill. "Never let water run straight down into town," he said. At 9, Agnes thought it was one of his strange sayings. At 14, she found it embarrassing. Boys at school called her father the ditch man. Some men at the feed store called him old railroad fool, though never when he was close enough to hear. They said he cared more about rocks than crops. Agnes hated the way the words followed her. She hated the stone rows too, for a while. They made their farm look poor and unfinished. Other fields on the ridge had clean fence lines and straight tractor marks. The Whitlow field looked as if a giant hand had dragged broken bones across the slope. When Agnes was 17, she asked him directly, "If they matter so much, why don't you tell people what they are?" Samuel was sharpening a scythe behind the barn. The metal made a slow, dry whisper against the stone. He stopped, but he did not look at her. "Some things get worse when spoken before their time," he said. "That doesn't mean anything." "It will." She waited for more. None came. That was Samuel's way. He carried the past like a locked box, close enough to touch, never open enough to see inside. He rarely spoke about the railroad years. Agnes knew only fragments, long shifts in rain, men sleeping in bunkhouses near the spur, a flood before she was born, a company report with her father's name in it, and months afterward, when nobody in Ridgeford offered him steady work. Her mother, Lillian, would lower her voice whenever the railroad came up. "Leave him be," she would tell Agnes. "Your father paid for things you don't know about." But not knowing became its own kind of wound. Agnes left Ridgeford at 21. For 3 years, she lived where sidewalks were flat and rain went into drains without asking anything from her. She almost convinced herself that land could be only land, that a daughter could choose not to inherit her father's burdens. Then her mother got sick. Agnes came home in late October. The maple trees had gone red above the ridge, and Samuel was thinner than she remembered. He moved through the house quietly, setting medicine by Lillian's bed and folding blankets no one asked him to fold. But every time rain came, he still walked up to the stone rose with his coat collar raised. After Lillian died, he changed, not loudly. Samuel had never been loud. He simply became more careful with everything. He cleaned his railroad watch every Sunday, though it no longer kept true time. He wrote numbers on scraps of paper and burned them in the stove. He stood sometimes at the lowest row with his hat in both hands. Agnes asked him once who he was praying for. He answered, "For the ones who didn't get named." She thought grief had bent his mind toward ghosts. Years later, when Samuel's lungs began to fail, Agnes moved his bed near the downstairs window so he could see the hill. Rain came 3 nights before he died. Agnes woke to find him trying to sit up. "The rose," he whispered. "They're fine, Daddy. You have to promise." "I know." His eyes sharpened with a fear she had never seen in him before. "No," he said, "not just keep them, listen to them." She took his old brass watch from the table and placed it in his palm. On the back, beneath scratches and age, was the symbol she had seen since childhood. A triangle crossed by 3 thin lines. "What does it mean?" she asked. Samuel closed his fingers over it, but whatever answer had lived in him stayed there. His breath broke before the words did. So Agnes made the promise without understanding it. She kept the field, she kept the rose, she kept the watch in her purse on storm days, and for years that seemed like enough. Until Quinn Harrow's maps erased the slope, Calvin Baird's models erased the basin, and Matt's tired eyes asked her to choose the living over the dead. That night, after the meeting, Agnes sat alone at her kitchen table with the developer's offer beside her father's watch. The rain tapped the roof in a rhythm she knew too well. For the first time in 74 years, she wondered if Samuel had not been protecting the stones from Ridgeford. Maybe he had been protecting Ridgeford from what the stones still remembered. In daylight, the stone rows looked smaller than the argument around them. They did not rise like walls. They did not stand straight like fences. From the county road, they appeared as broken gray seams across Agnes Whitlow's back field, half swallowed by broomgrass, moss, and the stubborn weeds that came up after every wet spring. There were 5 main rows, though most people only noticed 3. The upper row sat beneath a line of hickory trees, where the slope first began to fall. The second row bent slightly east, then broke around a patch of wild blackberry. The third ran low and crooked, vanishing in tall grass before appearing again near an old cedar stump. The fourth was barely visible except after rain. The fifth, the lowest and oldest, lay near the hollow below the pasture, where the earth dipped as if a giant thumb had pressed it down long ago. Agnes knew each row by feel. She knew which stones loosened after March thaw. She knew where the grass grew darker because water lingered underneath. She knew which place her father had made her step over as a child because, he said, that was where the hill changed its mind. But Ridgeford did not see any of that. To the town, the stone rows were leftovers, field trash, a poor man's boundary. Something Samuel Whitlow had built because he could not afford proper fencing or because grief, age, and railroad work had left him strange. Farmers hated them because they broke rhythm. A tractor wanted straight lines, and the Whitlow field refused to give them. Mowers caught on hidden rock. Hay wagons had to turn wide. Boys cutting across the pasture at night tripped and cursed Agnes's family name before limping home. Matt saw them differently, but not kindly. To him, they were one more reason the farm had never recovered. Every acre interrupted by stone was an acre that could not be worked cleanly. Every crooked row was another excuse buyers used to lower the price before Quinn Harrow came along and raised it. Quinn saw only obstruction. On his printed plans, the rows were thin gray marks beneath cabin lots. They had no height, no weight, no memory. His engineers called them surface rock alignments, a phrase that made them sound accidental, something the land had done by mistake. Agnes tried once, years earlier, to explain them to Matt. Not with history. She did not know enough history. With water, she took him up the ridge after a summer thunderstorm, back when he was still in college and still came home with city shoes he forgot to protect. The rain had stopped, but the field was alive with movement. Thin streams slipped down through the grass, shining in the late light. "Watch there," she told him. Matt looked where she pointed. Water hit the upper row and slowed. Some of it sank, some of it slid sideways. A little spilled through a gap and broke apart before reaching the second row. "It's just runoff," he said. "Everything is just something until it does damage." He had smiled then, tired but gentle, as if she had said one of Samuel's old sayings by accident. Years later, Agnes understood his smile better. Matt did not hate the stones. He simply could not afford to believe in them. After the Grange Hall meeting, Agnes walked the field alone. The rain had settled into a fine, steady fall, not hard enough to flood anything, only enough to darken the stones and bring out their hidden colors. Some turned blue-gray, some showed veins of rust, others stayed pale, almost white, as if they belonged to a different hill. She started at the upper row, moving slowly with her cane in one hand and her father's watch in her coat pocket. The brass case bumped against her hip with each step. At the first row, water gathered in small fans above the stones. At the second, it split around a clump of sedge. At the third, it crossed through 3 narrow gaps Samuel had always kept clear. Agnes had cleared those gaps too, though she had never admitted to anyone that she did it from habit more than understanding. By the 4th row, the field changed. The slope eased for a few yards before falling again toward the hollow. Here the grass was thicker, darker, colder at the roots. Agnes pressed her boot into it and watched water rise around the sole. The hollow below did not look like much. It was only a shallow depression, hidden in summer by goldenrod and milkweed. Children once used it as a place to hide during games. Hunters crossed it without noticing. Quinn's map had marked it as buildable ground, but standing above it in the rain, Agnes saw what the map had missed. Every row leaned toward it, not directly, not obviously, but the lines all bent, one after another, guiding water sideways before letting it drop. It was not a wall. It was a hand slowing a fall. Her breath caught. "Daddy," she whispered, "what did you make?" She moved toward the lowest row. The stones there were larger than the others, buried deeper, their top edges just visible through the grass. Samuel had always forbidden her to move these. Even when Frost heaved one corner upward, he would reset it himself, slow and silent, using a pry bar, wedges, and a patience that seemed almost like fear. Agnes knelt beside the first large stone. Mud soaked through her skirt. She ignored it. The stone was not shaped like the others. Most fieldstone had rough, broken faces. But this one had a flatter surface turned outward, as if someone had wanted it to be seen from below the hill. Moss covered half of it. Agnes took a handkerchief from her pocket and rubbed gently. At first, she found only scratches. Then the rainwater filled the cuts and made them dark. R. S. Disset. Agnes stared. The letters were too deliberate to be damage, too clean to be nature. Beneath them was a short line and a small angled mark that made the skin at the back of her neck tighten. It was not the same as the symbol on Samuel's watch, but it belonged to the same hand or the same language. She pulled the watch from her pocket and turned it over. The scratched triangle crossed by 3 thin lines caught the gray light. For the first time, Agnes did not see it as decoration or damage. She saw it as instruction. The rain kept falling. Water slipped around her knees and gathered at the stone's base, then bent away toward the hollow, as if obeying a command no living person had spoken in decades. Agnes wiped the next stone. Nothing. The 3rd stone had only a shallow groove. The 4th had initials too faint to read. By the 6th, she found a date cut so low she had to press her cheek near the wet grass to see it. 1937, the year Nora Pike had once mentioned in passing. The year of the old flood people in Ridgeford spoke of only when comparing storms, never when naming blame. Agnes sat back on her heels. For years, she had thought the rows were something her father built to protect the town from water. Now, she wondered if they had also been built to protect something from the town. The next morning, she placed the developer's offer, the railroad watch, and a mud-stained rubbing of RS-17 into a brown envelope. Then she drove toward the county archive, where maps were supposed to remember what people forgot. The county archive sat behind the courthouse in a brick building that had once been the Ridgeford tax office. Its windows were narrow, its basement smelled of dust and old paper, and its front door stuck whenever the weather turned wet. Agnes arrived before noon, with a brown envelope tucked beneath her coat. Inside were 3 things: Quinn Harrow's offer, her father's railroad watch, and a rubbing of the letters she had found on the lowest stone. Heiress. Disset. The clerk behind the counter was a young woman named Bethany, with polished nails and a patient smile. She listened while Agnes asked for old drainage maps, railroad spur records, and any survey showing a basin below the Whitlow field. Bethany typed. Then she typed again. "I'm not finding a spill basin on that parcel," she said. "It may not be called that. What else would it be called?" Agnes hesitated. She did not know. Bethany searched by property number, by Whitlow, by Ridgeford Spur, by flood, and by drainage. The computer gave them tax maps, road repairs, culvert replacements, and a few faded references to railroad easements. Nothing showed stone rows. Nothing showed a diversion. Nothing showed the hollow below Agnes's pasture. "It might be older than the county system," Agnes said. Bethany looked apologetic. "A lot of things are." That was when Calvin Baird walked in carrying a rolled map tube under one arm. He stopped when he saw Agnes. "Mrs. Whitlow, Mr. Baird." His eyes dropped to the rubbing on the counter. "What's that?" "Something from the lowest row." He leaned over, careful not to touch it. "Initials? Maybe. Or a crew mark." Calvin's expression tightened slightly, not with anger, but with the discomfort of a man being asked to step outside the lines of his job. "I checked the current flood layers after the meeting," he said. "There is still no registered structure on your property. My father's stones were there before your layers. I understand that. But if there's no official documentation, I can't classify them as flood infrastructure. You saw the slope. I saw an old field with surface rock." Agnes folded the rubbing back into the envelope. Calvin softened his voice. "I'm not saying your father didn't believe they mattered. I'm saying belief isn't enough to stop a review." There it was again. Belief. As if Samuel Whitlow had guessed. As if 70 years of stone, mud, and storm had been only a feeling passed from a dying man to a daughter too stubborn to let it go. When Agnes left the archive, Quinn Harrow's white survey flags were already visible on the ridge. They had appeared like small paper wounds in the field, one near the upper row, one beside the blackberry patch, 3 more above the lowest stones. A wooden stake had been driven so close to the hollow that Agnes could see fresh mud around its base from the road. She pulled over before reaching the house. A man in a yellow rain jacket was walking the field with a tablet. Quinn stood beside him, clean boots planted on wet grass, one hand in his coat pocket. Agnes crossed the ditch slowly. "You're early," she said. Quinn turned with the pleasant face he used in public. "Just preliminary marking. Nothing is being removed. You put a stake in my hollow. Our surveyor marked a low area. It is not just a low area." Quinn glanced toward the stones. "Mrs. Whitlow, if there is anything here worth preserving, we can document it properly. Photograph it. Move selected stones near the lodge entrance. Maybe even put up a plaque about your father." Agnes stared at him. A plaque. That was how easily he could turn a warning into decoration. "My father did not build those rows for guests to read between check-in and dinner." Quinn's smile thinned. "Then help us understand what he built them for." For one dangerous second, Agnes almost admitted she did not fully know. Instead, Matt's truck came up the road too fast and stopped behind hers. He stepped out without a coat. "Mom," he said, "what are you doing out here with them? Trying to stop them from marking what they don't understand." Matt looked at the flags, then at Quinn, then at the wet field. "I got a call from the bank this morning." Agnes felt the sentence before it finished. "They won't extend again," he said. "Not unless there's a signed purchase agreement or collateral we don't have." Quinn looked away, polite enough to pretend he was not listening. Matt lowered his voice. "You went to the archive instead of calling the lawyer." "I needed the maps. We need money." Agnes turned toward him. "There is something in those rows. There are rocks in those rows." His words came out sharper than he meant. His face changed at once, but the damage had already entered the rain between them. Agnes looked at her son and saw the boy who used to follow Samuel up the hill. She also saw the man who had learned the price of roofs, taxes, medicine, fuel, and stubbornness. "You think I'm choosing stones over you," she said. Matt swallowed. "I think Grandpa left you with a burden he never explained, and I think you're letting it take the farm." That hurt because it was close to what Agnes feared. By evening, the rain had strengthened. Agnes waited until Matt drove back to town before she carried a shovel, a pry bar, and a flashlight up to the hollow below the lowest row. She told herself she was only clearing the grass around the stone with RS-17. She told herself she would not dig, but the water had begun to gather in shallow sheets above the 4th row, and every sheet bent toward the hollow. Agnes followed it. The hollow was slick with wet grass. goldenrod stems slapped against her coat. Her flashlight beam shook over mud, stones, and the white flags Quinn's surveyor had planted too close to the place Samuel had always told her not to disturb. She knelt near the largest stone and scraped mud from its base. Water filled the scrape at once. She dug again. Something flat appeared beneath the mud. Not fieldstone, not loose rock. A fitted slab. Her hand trembled as she cleared one edge. The slab ran wider than her reach, set level beneath the grass, hidden so well that decades of children, hunters, and surveyors had crossed it without knowing it was there. A truck slowed on the road above. Agnes turned. Her neighbor, Ray Bell, leaned out his window and shouted through the rain. "Digging for ghosts now, Agnes?" Someone inside the truck laughed. Agnes did not answer. Her boot slipped when she tried to stand. The mud took her balance, and she went down hard on one knee, pain flashing up her leg. The flashlight rolled away, its beams spinning across the hollow. Ray's truck moved on. By morning, the story would be all over Ridgeford. Agnes Whitlow had been out in the rain, digging for ghosts beneath her father's rocks. But Agnes stayed where she was, breathing through the pain, one hand pressed against the flat slab under the mud, because under her palm, she felt a narrow groove cut into the stone. Not random, not natural. A line, and the line pointed straight toward the basin no county map remembered. Agnes did not tell Matt about the slab that night. By the time she made it back to the farmhouse, her knee had swollen, her coat was soaked through, and mud had dried along one side of her face. She washed in the downstairs sink with the light off, because she did not want to see herself clearly. Not yet. The next morning, every step hurt. But before coffee, before breakfast, before she unfolded Quinn Harrow's offer again, Agnes went to the kitchen window and looked toward the ridge. The rain had eased to a mist. Low clouds sat over the hickory trees. The stone rows were hidden from the house by distance and grass, but Agnes could see the pale survey flags Quinn's crew had left behind. They looked brighter now, more arrogant. She waited until the ache in her knee settled into something she could stand. Then she wrapped it, took her cane, and climbed the field again. The hollow held water in shallow patches. Nothing dramatic, nothing anyone would call proof. The fitted slab she had touched the night before had disappeared beneath a skin of brown runoff, as if the hill had closed its mouth. Agnes knelt carefully and brushed her fingers through the mud until she found the groove again. The line cut across the slab, then vanished under grass. She followed it with her eyes. It pointed not straight downhill, but toward the west edge of the hollow, where sedge grew thick and dark. Agnes stood there for a long time, listening. Not to words, to movement. A thin stream of water slid down from the fourth row. It reached the hidden slab, struck the raised edge, and turned. Not much. Only a few inches. But it turned. It ran along the groove, disappeared into the sedge, then emerged lower down in a second line she had never noticed before. Her breath caught. She moved uphill. At the third row, water came through 3 narrow breaks Samuel had always kept clear. Agnes remembered his boot pressing leaves away from those openings. She had thought he was being particular. Now she saw that the openings were not gaps from neglect. They were gates. At the second row, water spread wide and shallow, losing speed before it reached the third. At the upper row, rain from the hickory line gathered, struck stone, and broke into thin fans. There it was. Not a wall. Not a ditch. A conversation. Each row slowed the water enough for the next row to take it. Each bend changed the fall. Each gap fed the hollow without letting the hill empty itself all at once. Samuel had not built stone rows. He had built time. Agnes laughed once. Not because anything was funny, but because the sound rose out of her before she could stop it. It was small and broken and almost frightened. Then she heard a truck door. Matt stood at the edge of the field in his work jacket, hair damp from the mist. "I came by to check on you," he said. "Ray Bell told everyone you fell." "I didn't fall. Mum. I slipped." He looked at her knee. "You should have called me. You would have told me to stay inside, because you're 74 and digging in a storm." "I wasn't digging." Matt's eyes moved to the mud on her cane, then to the hollow. Agnes did not argue. She only pointed. "Watch that water." He sighed, but he looked. For a few seconds, nothing happened that would change a practical man's mind. Water moved through grass. Rain fell. A flag trembled in the wet wind. Then a narrow stream came down from the third row, hit the edge of the hidden slab, and bent west. Matt frowned. Agnes said nothing. Another thin stream followed the same path. "It's just finding the lowest spot," he said. "No," Agnes said. "It's being taken there." Matt walked closer, boots sinking in soft ground. He looked uphill, then down toward the hollow. For the first time since the meeting, his face held something other than fear or frustration. Not belief, but interruption. A thought had stopped halfway through him. "Did Grandpa build that?" he asked. "I think so. Why didn't he tell anyone?" Agnes looked at the lowest row, where RS-17 waited beneath moss and mud. "I'm starting to think he did," she said. "Just not in words." That afternoon, Agnes drove to see Nora Pike. Nora had been Ridgeford's librarian for 38 years and still kept more of the town's memory in her house than the county kept in its archive. She lived in a narrow white place behind the closed Methodist church, with newspapers stacked by decade and a card catalog in her dining room because she said no computer had ever learned how to doubt properly. Agnes laid the rubbing on Nora's table. RS. Deset. Nora put on her reading glasses, then took them off again and held the paper closer. "Where did you find this?" "Lowest stone row." Nora's mouth tightened. "You remember something." "I remember too many things out of order." Agnes waited. Nora opened a drawer and removed a folder tied with blue string. Inside were clippings, photocopies, handwritten notes, and one brittle newspaper page with a headline Agnes had never seen. "Rail spur drainage error, blamed in 1937 flood damage." Agnes read the words once. Then again, her father's name appeared halfway down the column. Samuel Whitlow, labor foreman, signed a statement acknowledging improper placement of diversion stone near the North Ridge. The room seemed to tilt. "No," Agnes said. Nora did not answer quickly. Agnes gripped the edge of the table. "My father would never send water down on Ridgeford. The article doesn't say he meant to. It says he did it. It says he signed." Those were different things. Agnes knew that before Nora said it. She knew it in the place inside her where Samuel's silence had lived for 70 years. Nora turned another page. There were men on that crew whose names never showed up in the final report. Immigrant workers. Black laborers from the lower rail camp. Men people in town called temporary, even after they had lived here for years. Agnes looked at the rubbing again. RS 17. Not a survey number. Maybe. A personne. A crew. A mark left where paper could be destroyed. Outside Nora's window, thunder rolled low over the ridge. Nora glanced toward the glass. "Forecast changed an hour ago," she said. "They're calling for heavier rain tonight." Agnes folded the clipping with careful hands. For the first time, she was afraid not that her father had been wrong, but that he had been blamed for telling the truth too early. By evening, the ditches were full. The sky had turned the color of iron, and water had begun gathering above the upper row faster than Agnes had ever seen it gather before. By 8 that night, the rain had stopped sounding like weather and started sounding like weight. It hit the roof in sheets. It ran down the farmhouse windows in silver ropes. It filled the gutters until they spat water over the edges, then poured from the broken corner above the back steps, where the barn roof had been waiting 3 years for money Agnes did not have. On the kitchen radio, the forecast changed again. Flash flood warning, North Ridge watershed, low-lying streets in Ridgeford. Agnes stood beside the table with Nora Pike's clipping spread open under the yellow light. Samuel's name stared up from the old newspaper like an accusation that had waited 86 years to be read aloud. Improper placement of diversion stone. She folded the clipping once and placed it in a plastic bread bag, then slipped it into her coat pocket with the railroad watch. Outside, thunder rolled over the hill. Matt had stayed after dinner, though he had not said why. He stood by the sink, watching his mother pull on her boots. "No," he said. Agnes reached for her cane. "Mom, no, not tonight. The upper gaps will clog." "You don't know that." "I do." "You think you do." She turned to him. For the first time all day, Agnes did not look stubborn. She looked frightened. "That's worse," she said. "Thinking I know and staying inside." Matt stared at her, then grabbed his jacket from the chair. "If you're going, I'm going." The field was almost black when they reached it. Rain came sideways across the slope. The flashlight beam caught only pieces of the world at a time. Grass flattened by water, white survey flags snapping hard in the wind, stones shining like wet backs of animals crouched in the dark. Above the first row, Runoff was already gathering from the hickory line. Not thin streams now, sheets. Water rushed out of the trees and struck the upper stones with a sound like cloth being torn. It rose, shuddered, spread wide, and spilled sideways. Agnes moved toward the first break with her cane in one hand and a rake in the other. Leaves had packed into the gap. She pulled them free. Water jumped through, but not straight down. It broke apart, fanning toward the second row in 3 separate channels. Matt saw it. He did not speak. At the second row, a branch had lodged between 2 stones. Agnes reached for it, but her bad knee buckled in the mud. Matt caught her by the elbow before she fell. "Tell me what to do," he shouted. She pointed. "Clear that. Not the whole row, just that notch." He pulled the branch loose. The water surged. For one terrible second, it seemed ready to cut straight through the field. Then it struck the third row, split again, and ran west across the slope toward the hollow. Matt stood frozen in the rain. Agnes shouted his name. He moved. Together they worked their way down the rows, not building anything, not changing anything, only freeing what Samuel had built long before them. Leaves, twigs, and trash from Quinn's survey crew came loose under their hands. Every cleared gap changed the water. Every stone seemed to take pressure, pass it sideways, and slow the hill's collapse by a few precious breaths. Below them, Ridgeford's lights blurred in the rain. Then one set of headlights appeared on the road. Then another. Calvin Baird arrived in a county truck with orange hazard lights spinning against the dark. 2 road crew workers followed him. Quinn Harrow pulled in behind them in a black SUV, his coat collar raised, his face pale in the flashing light. Calvin climbed halfway up the slope, boots sinking. "Mrs. Whitlow," he shouted, "you need to get out of this field." Agnes did not turn. "Look at the water." "I am looking at the water." "No," she shouted back. "Look where it goes." Calvin raised his flashlight. From where he stood, the field suddenly made sense in a way no map on his desk ever had. The water should have dropped straight from the ridge toward the road below. The model had said it would. The clean blue lines on his county printouts had insisted on it. But the real water did not obey the printouts. It struck the upper row and spread. It met the second and slowed. It broke against the third and turned. By the fourth row, the flood was no longer one dangerous rush. It had become several lower channels, all bending toward the hollow Agnes had tried to name. The hidden spill basin took the first heavy surge just before 10. It filled with a deep, swallowing sound. Water poured in from 3 directions, churned brown under the rain, then pushed west into an old grass depression that had not appeared on any county layer. The flow that should have charged toward Main Street lost its force in the basin and escaped in pieces. Calvin's flashlight dropped slightly. Behind him, Quinn's survey flags tore loose one by one. They spun in the current like scraps of surrender. One flag caught against the lowest row and folded under the muddy water. Quinn stared at it, then at Agnes. "This doesn't prove historical status," he said too loudly. No one answered him. Not Calvin, not Matt, not even the road crew workers standing near the ditch, watching the water miss the road by yards that suddenly looked like mercy. For nearly an hour, the hill worked. That was how Agnes thought of it. Not the stones alone, not the hollow alone. The hill itself, taught by hands no one had respected enough to remember. When the rain finally softened, Ridgeford was still there. Main Street had water in its gutters and mud across the lower parking lot, but the storefront windows were not broken. The church basement was wet but not drowned. The old bakery at the corner, the one everyone had expected to take water first, still had light in its front window. Calvin walked down to the hollow without speaking. Agnes followed more slowly, leaning harder on her cane than she wanted anyone to see. Matt stayed close enough to catch her if she slipped, but he did not touch her unless she needed him. The basin had begun to drain. As the water lowered, mud peeled away from the lowest row. One stone emerged, then another, then 6 more. Calvin aimed his flashlight. At first, Agnes saw only wet rock. Then the cuts darkened. R.S. 17. Man, te, Uhdeksan. J. Beltri. A date. 1937. Another symbol, the triangle crossed by 3 lines. Matt exhaled sharply. Calvin crouched, touching nothing. "These were carved," he said. Agnes almost laughed at the smallness of the sentence. "Yes." Quinn stepped closer, but Matt moved in front of him without planning to. "Don't," Matt said. Quinn looked at him. Matt did not move. Agnes knelt beside the row. Rainwater ran down her face, or maybe it was not all rain. For most of her life, she had thought her father left her stones because he had not known how to explain himself. Now she understood something worse and larger. He had explained himself. He had written it where paper could rot, where officials could look away, where maps could forget, but water would keep returning until someone finally read the hill correctly. Calvin stood slowly. "I need to file an emergency report," he said. Quinn's face changed. Because in that moment, the argument was no longer about whether the stone rows were useless. Agnes had won that part. Now the question was who would control what they meant. By morning, Ridgeford had already changed its story. Not completely. No town changed that fast. But the laughter had thinned. At the diner, people who had joked about Agnes digging for ghosts now spoke more carefully when her name came up. At the feed store, Ray Bell told the story of the flood twice, but in his second telling he left out the part where he had laughed from his truck. By noon, 3 different people had said they always figured Samuel Whitlow knew more than folks gave him credit for. Agnes heard none of it directly. She was at her kitchen table with her knee wrapped, her father's watch open beside Nora Pike's clipping, and a county notice newly delivered under the storm door. Temporary sight hold. The words should have comforted her. They did not. Matt read the page first. His mouth tightened as he reached the second paragraph. "What does it say?" Agnes asked. He did not answer right away. "That the county is placing the lowest field under emergency review," he said. "No removal, no alteration, no private work around the rows or basin until further assessment. That stops Quinn. It also stops you." Agnes held out her hand for the notice. Matt did not give it to her at once. "Mom, if they decide this is flood infrastructure, they may claim an easement. If they decide it's historical, they may freeze the land. If Quinn sues because his project is delayed, we cannot fight all of them." Agnes looked toward the window. The field beyond the house was quiet now. After the violence of the night before, the silence felt staged, almost dishonest. "They saw it work," she said. "I know. Then why do I feel like I just lost more of it?" Before Matt could answer, Quinn Harrow arrived. He did not come alone this time. A woman in a dark coat stepped out of his SUV with a leather folder under one arm. Quinn introduced her as Maris Venn, a preservation consultant from a firm 2 counties over. Agnes did not invite them inside. They stood on the porch, while water dripped from the eaves. "Mrs. Whitlow," Quinn began, "last night changed the situation." "It did. I want you to know I'm prepared to be flexible. If the rows have flood or historical significance, we can incorporate that into the project." Matt stood behind Agnes in the doorway. Quinn continued, smooth as poured cream. "We can reroute 2 cabins, build a viewing path, protect selected stones, commission an interpretive sign. Your father's work could be honored publicly." Agnes looked at Maris Venn. "And the basin?" Maris opened the folder. "Depending on assessment, the basin could become a managed landscape feature." "A feature," Agnes said. Quinn's expression held. "A protected feature." "No," Agnes said. "You mean something guests look at while the rest gets paved around it." Maris tried to soften the moment. "Preservation often requires compromise." Agnes thought of the survey flags floating in muddy water like little bones. "Truth does too," she said. "But not with the person trying to buy it." Quinn's face changed only a little, just enough. "Be careful, Mrs. Whitlow. Temporary public sympathy does not pay legal fees." Matt stepped forward. That sounded like a threat. Quinn looked at him. "It is advice." After they left, Matt shut the door harder than necessary. "You see?" Agnes said. "He wants to own the story before anyone knows what it is." Matt turned on her. "And you want to open the story before we know what it will cost." The words hit the room like dropped glass. Agnes did not answer. Matt rubbed both hands over his face. "I saw the water, Mom. I saw what Grandpa built. I'm not calling you crazy anymore. That is generous. Don't do that." She looked away. He lowered his voice. "If those stones prove the railroad lied, or the county buried something, or families lost land because of it, this farm becomes evidence. Evidence does not belong to the people who live on it. It belongs to lawyers, committees, historians, courts. Do you understand that?" Agnes did. That was why she had been afraid since the first initials appeared in the mud. Matt sat across from her. Quinn's offer could still save the house. It would bury the rest. Maybe the rest will bury us. For a long moment, mother and son sat with the developer's money between them, though the paper itself was still in her purse. Then the phone rang. It was Nora. Her voice had lost its usual librarian calm. "Agnes," she said. "I found R.S." Agnes gripped the receiver. "Who?" "Rafael Serrano. Track crew, Ridgeford Spur. Listed in the 1936 payroll. Gone from the 1938 county directory. No death notice. No property transfer. No forwarding address." Agnes closed her eyes. "R.S. Dissett." Nora kept going. "MT9 may be Moses Turner. Black laborer, rail camp south of town. His family appears in the church charity ledger in 1937, then disappears from town records after the flood report." Agnes looked at Matt. He had gone still. "There are more," Nora said. "Not all clean matches. Some initials could be wrong. But Agnes, those numbers beside the names may not be dates. They may be crew positions, or payment lines, or housing lots. Can you prove it?" "Not yet." That was the knife inside every discovery. "Not yet." Nora inhaled. "There's something else." The final railroad report names Samuel Whitlow as labor foreman responsible for the misplaced diversion stone. But the payroll lists him as assistant hand, not foreman. Someone promoted him on paper after the fact. Agnes sat down slowly. Her father had not only signed blame, they had dressed him in a title he did not hold so the blame would fit better. Matt took the receiver from her hand and listened as Nora repeated the details. Agnes watched his face change, not into belief exactly, but into grief with structure. When he hung up, he did not speak for a while. Outside, the hillside lay under a washed gray sky. The lowest row was too far to see from the kitchen, but Agnes felt it there, holding names under mud and moss. Matt finally said, "If we do this, we need more than clippings and stones." Agnes nodded. "We need the whole map." That afternoon, with Calvin's temporary hold posted and Quinn's consultant already calling the rows a feature, Agnes carried Samuel's watch, Nora's names, and the old rubbing back toward the field. For 70 years, she had walked those stones as a daughter keeping a promise. Now she would have to walk them as a witness. And every mark she read might take the farm farther from her hands. The whole map did not reveal itself at once. That was the first thing Agnes had to accept. For 3 afternoons, she, Matt, and Nora Pike worked along the lowest row with knee pads, soft brushes, wax paper, pencils, and a camera Calvin Baird had lent them under the condition that nothing be moved. Calvin came once to mark the area with orange tape, then stood back like a man unsure whether he was protecting evidence or apologizing to it. The stones did not read like a sentence. They read like a field would read, broken, weathered, half-buried. Some marks clear as if cut yesterday, others softened by rain, frost, and 86 years of grass roots. R.S. Dissett. May. Uhdeksan. Val 12. Ye. Beltré. 2 stones carried only numbers. One carried a symbol Agnes first mistook for a cracked arrow. Another showed the triangle crossed by 3 lines. The same mark scratched into Samuel's railroad watch. Nora brought payroll sheets, church ledgers, old charity lists, and a county directory with pages missing where the rail camp should have been. Matt spread them on the kitchen table at night, matching initials to names by lamplight, while Agnes sat beside him with Samuel's watch in her palm. By the 4th night, the pattern changed. The numbers were not ages. They were not dates. They matched work assignments from a 1936 Ridgeford Spur payroll sheet Nora had found folded inside a church donation ledger. Crew position 17 belonged to Rafael Serrano, track hand. Position 9 belonged to Moses Turner, drainage laborer. Position 3 belonged to Joseph Bell, stone setter. Agnes stared at the list until the names blurred. "They put themselves in the hill," Matt said quietly. Nora shook her head. "Or Samuel put them there after." Agnes looked toward the dark window, where the ridge was only a shape against the night. "No," she thought, "not after." With them, the next piece came from Calvin. He arrived one morning with a copy of a 1937 railroad engineering memo he had found attached to an old culvert dispute. He looked as if he had not slept. "This was never filed with the county flood report," he said. Agnes took the paper. The memo described a company decision to redirect runoff from the upper rail bed away from a storage yard on company-owned high ground. To protect railroad property, a temporary drainage cut had been made above the worker houses south of town. The engineers called it efficient. The memo warned that in heavy rain, the cut could overload the lower settlement. 3 weeks later, the flood came. Agnes read the final line twice. Temporary field correction to be removed after seasonal risk. It had never been removed. The railroad saved its yard. The water went somewhere else. Downhill, toward people with no deeds strong enough, no lawyers close enough, and no names important enough to keep clean in the report. Samuel's crew had seen it coming. That was what the stones said. They built the diversion rows in the rain, trying to slow what the company had sent down the hill. They placed stone across Agnes's field because that was the only land between the ridge and Ridgeford where water could be broken apart before it gathered speed. They did not fail. They were too late to save everyone. The flood still took 3 worker houses. It ruined the Serrano family's rented plot. It washed out Moses Turner's cabin and the small vegetable ground his wife kept behind it. It left Joseph Bell's youngest daughter sick from standing all night in muddy water while the family waited for help that came first to the depot. Then the railroad wrote its report. Improper placement of diversion stone. Samuel Whitlow, labor foreman. Agnes pressed one hand to her mouth. He wasn't foreman, Matt said, though they all knew that now. Nora placed the payroll sheet beside the report. Assistant hand. Lower, wage line. No authority to order drainage work. Calvin's voice was low. They needed someone local, someone who could sign, someone the town would believe had touched those stones. Agnes shut her eyes. She saw her father's bent finger, his bad knee, his silence, his Sunday ritual of cleaning a watch that did not keep time, his hat in his hands at the lowest row. Why would he sign? Matt asked. No one answered, until Nora unfolded one last paper. It was not official. It was a copy of a letter written by Reverend Ames, the Methodist minister in 1937, to a regional church office. The letter had never been mailed. Nora had found it tucked into the back of a hymnal box after the church closed. Samuel Whitlow has agreed to bear responsibility, the Reverend wrote, because the company threatened prosecution against several campmen they call transient and disorderly. He fears Serrano will be deported from company housing, Turner arrested for trespass after losing his cabin, and Bell denied relief wages. Whitlow says if one name must be ruined, let it be one already rooted here. Agnes made a sound that was not quite a sob. For years, she had thought her father's silence meant shame. It had, but not the shame Ridgeford gave him. He had carried the shame of choosing one wound to prevent another. He signed a lie so other men would not be crushed by a larger one. Then he carved their names into stone because paper had already betrayed them. The truth did not make Samuel simple. That was the hardest part. He had protected men in the only way he thought he could. But he had also allowed the town to remember the flood wrong. He had allowed Agnes to grow up under a name people mocked. He had left her a promise without the story needed to carry it. The secret did not free her father from pain. It gave the pain shape. By the time they finished laying the papers across the kitchen table, 3 consequences were clear. The Serrano family had lost their rented land and vanished from Ridgeford records within a year. Moses Turner's family had been denied flood relief because the final report blamed unauthorized laborer alterations. Joseph Bell's daughter lived, but the illness ended her schooling, and her name never appeared in the graduation ledger Nora had kept for decades. And Samuel Whitlow's family inherited the stain. Not by accident, by design. Agnes stood from the table and walked to the window. The stone rows were invisible in the dark, but she knew where each one lay. She knew now that they were not just her father's work. They were the last remaining testimony of men the railroad had turned into absence. Matt came beside her. If we release this, he said, Quinn's project is dead. Yes. The county review gets bigger. Yes. The farm may be tied up for years. Agnes nodded. And if we don't? Matt looked at the table, at the names, at the report, at the lie built carefully enough to last almost a century. He did not answer. Agnes closed Samuel's watch and placed it on top of the railroad memo. For most of her life, she had believed keeping the stones was the promise. Now she understood. Keeping them had only been the first half. Reading them aloud was the rest. The second meeting at the Ridgeford Grange Hall was not like the first. No one joked about rocks when Agnes Whitlow walked in. The same folding chairs lined the floor. The same coffee urn hissed against the side table. Rain had left the windows streaked again, but this time people watched Agnes instead of the weather. Some looked ashamed. Some looked curious. A few looked frightened in the quiet way people look when they suspect an old story has been standing too close to them for years. Matt walked beside his mother, carrying a cardboard box full of papers. Nora Pike carried the church ledger. Calvin Baird stood at the front of the room before anyone called the meeting to order. He had placed 2 maps on easels, the county flood model, clean and printed in color, and a new hand-marked overlay showing the actual path of the water during the storm. The two did not agree. That was the first apology. Calvin did not begin with emotion. He began with responsibility. The county model was incomplete, he said. It did not include the stone diversion rows, the lower basin, or the westward overflow path below the Whitlow field. Because those features were not in our system, I dismissed Mrs. Whitlow's warning. He looked at Agnes. I was wrong. The room stayed still. Calvin turned a page. I have filed an emergency correction request. I have also requested that no removal, development, or alteration be permitted on the North Ridge until the stone rows and basin are formally assessed as flood control infrastructure. Quinn Harrow shifted in his seat. Calvin kept going. And because carvings on the lowest row appear to correspond with railroad labor records from 1936 and 1937, I am recommending a historical review independent of the developer's project. That was the second apology. Not the words. The action. Agnes did not nod. Not yet. Matt stepped forward next, though Agnes had not asked him to speak. His hands shook slightly as he opened the cardboard box and removed copies of the payroll sheets. My grandfather's name is on the old report, he said. For most of my life, I thought that report was just another reason people talked about the Whitlows like we were trouble. He glanced at his mother. I also thought these stones were taking the last good chance my mother had to save the farm. His voice caught, but he did not stop. I was not wrong about the money. The farm still owes taxes. The roof still leaks. My mother still has more winter than income ahead of her. But I was wrong about what she was protecting. He placed Samuel's payroll line on the table beside the railroad report. The report called Samuel Whitlow a labor foreman. The payroll called him assistant hand. Somebody changed his weight on paper so he could carry blame big enough for a company. A murmur passed through the room. Matt lifted one more page. These names carved into the stones are not decoration. They are men who worked here, lived here, and disappeared from the official story when the flood made somebody pay. Across the aisle, Ray Bell took off his cap. Quinn Harrow stood before the murmur could settle. He did not look angry. That would have been easier to fight. He looked solemn, respectful, almost moved. Mrs. Whitlow, he said, I want to say publicly that I underestimated the emotional and historical value of your father's work. Agnes watched him. Quinn turned to the room. My company is willing to fund a permanent historical marker, a viewing path, and preservation signage. We can redesign the resort footprint to honor the stone rows while still bringing economic life to Ridgeford. There it was. The same purchase, dressed in softer clothes. Nora Pike spoke from her chair. Honor is not the same as possession. Quinn's eyes flicked toward her. Neither is abandonment, he said. Without funding, who maintains the land? Who pays Mrs. Whitlow's taxes? Who protects the site from weather, trespass, or decay? It was the right question. That made it more dangerous. For a moment, the room shifted. People wanted the truth preserved. They also wanted roads fixed, jobs offered, taxes paid, and responsibility placed somewhere other than their own hands. Then a woman near the back stood. She was in her 50s, with dark hair pulled into a braid and a folded paper held against her chest. My name is Elena Serrano Alvarez, she said. Agnes turned slowly. The woman stepped into the aisle. My great-grandfather was Rafael Serrano. No one moved. Elena unfolded the paper. My family had a story that he left Ridgeford after a flood. We were told he had been careless with railroad work and lost his place. My grandmother grew up believing our name was tied to shame here. Her voice thinned. Yesterday, Mrs. Pike called me because of 2 letters and a number carved into a stone. Agnes looked at Nora. Nora's eyes were wet behind her glasses. Elena faced the room. I don't want a plaque at a resort. I don't want my great-grandfather's name placed beside rental cabins as atmosphere. I want to stand where he stood. I want my children to see the stone that kept his name when paper would not. The room changed then, not loudly, but deeply. A man Agnes did not know stood and said his grandmother had been a turner. An older woman near the front asked whether Moses Turner's family could be traced through church relief records. Ray Bell, still holding his cap, looked at Agnes and said, "I'm sorry for what I said from the road." Agnes accepted it with a small nod, because not every apology needed a speech. Quinn tried once more. "If this becomes a legal site, development stops indefinitely. Mrs. Whitlow may receive nothing." Matt answered before Agnes could. "Then maybe Ridgeford should stop asking one old woman to pay a loan for the truth everyone benefits from." By the end of the hearing, no final solution had been signed, but something had begun. Calvin agreed to draft a protection order. Nora agreed to publish a preliminary list of names and invite families to come forward. A local attorney offered to review land trust options without charge. The church board, which still owned the closed Methodist building, offered space for records. And Agnes, who had walked into the room carrying her father's silence, walked out carrying voices. Outside, Elena Serrano Alvarez asked if she could see the stone before dark. Agnes looked toward the north ridge. The path was muddy. The field was damaged. The legal fight had only begun, but for the first time, the promise did not feel like something Agnes had to carry by herself. "Yes," she said, "but we go slow. The ground remembers where it has been hurt." By the next spring, the North Ridge no longer looked abandoned. It did not look finished either. That mattered to Agnes. Finished things had a way of becoming decorations. A framed article, a polished plaque, a pretty story people could point to without changing how they lived. The stone rows had never asked to be pretty. They had asked to be left where water could find them. So that was where they stayed. The Ridgeford North Slope Land Trust was not large. It began with 27 acres of Agnes Whitlow's backfield, the lower hollow, the old spill basin, and the 5 stone rows that crossed the hill like weathered hands. The papers took months. The arguments took longer. Quinn Harrow filed 2 objections, then withdrew one when Calvin Baird's emergency flood assessment became part of the county record. The resort project did not vanish all at once. It shrank first, then stalled, then became something investors spoke about in past tense. Agnes did not become rich. That was important too. There was no sudden check large enough to erase winter, no miracle buyer, no reward from the railroad's successor company, which issued a statement full of regret and very little responsibility. The barn roof was patched by volunteers from town, not replaced. The back taxes were reduced through a county preservation arrangement, not forgiven by magic. Agnes still kept the kitchen thermostat low. She still counted medicine bottles before town trips. And some mornings, when her knee hurt and the wind came through the old window frame, she thought about Quinn's offer and understood exactly what she had given up. The money would have made life easier. The truth had only made life wider. Matt came every other weekend at first, then more often. He stopped wearing city shoes to the field. He bought a pair of rubber boots and left them by Agnes's back door, still tagged with mud from his first clumsy attempts to walk the rows without stepping where Samuel would have scolded him. Agnes did not teach him quickly. Samuel had not taught quickly either. She showed Matt how the upper row took the first anger out of rain, how the second row spread water thin, how the third row gave it choices, how the fourth row slowed what remained, how the lowest row did not stop the flood, but asked it to turn before it became cruel. One afternoon, Matt stood above the hollow with his hands on his hips, looking down toward Ridgeford. He wasn't trying to beat the water, he said. Agnes looked at him. No, he was trying to give it somewhere else to go. She nodded. Matt swallowed and looked away. I wish I'd asked him more. Agnes almost said she did too. Instead, she placed Samuel's railroad watch in Matt's hand. The watch still did not keep time. Its hands stayed fixed near 12, as if refusing to choose morning or midnight. On the back, the triangle crossed by 3 lines had been cleaned but not polished. Agnes had decided some scratches deserved to remain visible. He left us what he could, she said. Matt closed his fingers around it. Below them, Calvin Baird was walking a group of high school students along the marked safe path. He carried no projector, no flood model, no clean county map, just a clipboard, a rain gauge, and a pair of muddy boots. Maps are useful, Calvin told the students. But maps are not memory. When the land disagrees with the map, you do not correct the land first. Agnes heard that and smiled. Nora Pike continued her own work from the old Methodist church, where the land trust had given her a room for records. She built a long table out of 2 church doors and covered it with copies of payroll sheets, photographs, church ledgers, relief notes, and letters from families who had begun writing back. The Serrano family came in April. The Turners came in May. A Bell descendant arrived in June with a photograph of a little girl standing beside a cabin Agnes had never seen, wearing a dress too thin for the mud around her ankles. Each family was taken up the ridge slowly. No speeches at first, only the walk. Elena Serrano Alvarez brought her children on a clear Sunday after church. Her youngest son, Daniel, was 7 and impatient until he saw his great-great-grandfather's mark on the lowest row. R.S. Disset. He touched the stone with 2 fingers. "Is that ours?" he asked. Elena looked at Agnes before answering. Agnes shook her head gently. "No," she said. "It isn't only yours, and it isn't only mine." The boy thought about that, serious in the way children become when adults finally tell the truth plainly. "Then who keeps it?" Matt stood beside the row, Samuel's watch in his pocket. "We all do," he said. By late summer, the grass around the rows was trimmed by volunteers who had learned not to cut too close. The hollow was cleared of brush but not reshaped. The basin was marked, not paved. No gift shop appeared. No statue of Samuel Whitlow stood on the hill. Agnes would not allow that. "My father spent his life trying not to be the only name," she told the Land Trust Board. So instead, a simple cedar sign was placed at the field entrance. It listed no heroes at the top, only a sentence Nora had helped write. These rows were built by hands the records failed to keep. Below that, the names found so far were carved in plain order, with blank spaces left for those still missing. Autumn came softly to Ridgeford. On the first light rain of October, Agnes walked the field with Matt and a small group of students from Calvin's class. The sky was gray, the grass bent silver, and the stones darkened one by one as the rain touched them. A girl with a red notebook stopped beside the third row. "How do you know where the water will go?" she asked. Agnes looked down the slope. For a moment, she saw Samuel there as he had been when she was 9. Bad knee, bent finger, burlap sack over one shoulder, listening to the hill before asking it to explain. She could have given the girl a lesson about contour, stone, basin, and flow. Instead, Agnes rested one hand on the wet rock. "You start by listening," she said, "before it gets loud." The rain kept falling. Not hard, not yet. Above them, the water gathered at the upper row, slowed, spread, and turned. And Ridgeford, at last, let it.